So we have been working through Matthew's gospel, Matthew's account of Jesus' life, from one of the people that spent 3.5 years, one of his 12, one of his closest students and friends. And so we're hearing his perspective on Jesus' life. And in that narrative that explains those times, we're nearing close to the cross. We're kind of on track, kind of as Easter approaches, to go through some of those types of moments in Jesus' life as well. Over the last few weeks, we've been looking at different images that surface that give us a little better picture of what exactly Jesus was experiencing and maybe some ways that we can relate to those things as well. Today, we're not necessarily focused on one main image, but there is a theme and an image that's going to come out in our conversation, and that's the theme of scarlet, of red, of scarlet. And maybe you think about some times in the Bible when you've heard the word red or scarlet come up in reference to things. And that's something we're going to tie in with Jesus' life and hopefully find a little bit deeper meaning behind some things this morning as well. But the point in time in Jesus' life that we're walking into is after he was betrayed, after he was arrested, he was taken to the house of the high priest at the time, who was Caiaphas, probably a very large home in the center of Jerusalem, just to the west of where the temple was located at that time. And he's gathered before the scribes and some of the priests and some of the 70, the rulers, the court. You can think of it as the Supreme Court of Israel at that point in time. Even though Roman rule was instated and Caesar was technically in charge, the Jewish people had their own kind of system of dealing with things, especially religious-related things. And so they had 70 different elders who would make decisions and judgments. And so this is the middle of the night. They weren't supposed to gather in the middle of the night to make judgments, but in this case they were, to try to avoid the crowds who were gathered at Passover, and they were about to judge Jesus. And I think this is actually relevant for us, because I would say, I'm going to try to make the case for this morning. I think all of us have to judge Jesus at one point or another. And there might be different things that we judge Jesus based on. It might be who we see him to be, as recorded by people who were near him, which we're looking at today. It might be based on something that we've heard from somebody else. Somebody tells us, well, this is who Jesus is, and you think, well, they said it, I trust them, I'll believe it. It might be based on, a church that you've been a part of and what somebody said, related with the church or Bible study or something. Or it might just be related, to some of your own ideas or cultural ideas about Jesus. And so we're going to take a look at that question, and maybe it'll be a moment where it's a good, point in our lives to ask ourselves that question. I also think that it's not a question that we should come to an answer to lightly, and so I would not encourage you to make your decisions about who you think Jesus is as a result of the next 20 or 25 minutes this morning. I think it's much more time often that we need to really approach that question and figure out who is Jesus for ourselves. We each, I think, get to that point. But we're going to look at some claims that different people made about Jesus, and maybe as they make these claims, it'll help you process, what are you thinking about Jesus? How would you judge him, who he is, or define him as a person? So we're going to get into that story. It's at the end of Matthew 26. I've got the words up on the screen, but if you want to follow along with Bibles on your phone or in hand, that's fine too. We're going to start in verse 57 of Matthew 26 and just kind of jump into this. It says, those who had arrested Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders, that group of 70 people, had convened. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin, that was the name of their court, their Jewish court, were looking for false testimony against Jesus so they could put him to death. Normally, you don't want the judge to have already decided the case before anybody steps into the courtroom. But that's kind of the case here. They wanted this trial to end in a very specific way, and that's not just. That's not justice. But it says they couldn't find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But finally, there were two people, and they came forward and they said this. This man, pointing to Jesus, he said, I can destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. So, again, the temple in Jerusalem, it was Herod's temple. It was the second temple that was really built, the majestic temple. Solomon's temple had been destroyed hundreds of years earlier. But this was no small architectural and building feat. It took them 46 years to build this structure that was sitting on the Temple Mount in the first century, up until the time that Rome destroyed it in 70 AD. So Jesus said, I can destroy that building that took 46 years to build, and I can build it again in 3 days. just kind of put that in perspective. Let's say that we were going to hire another pastor here at Mountain View, get another pastor on board. And we brought that individual up in front of the church and we said, anybody got any information on this individual, things you think would be pertinent to us making that decision? And somebody said, yeah, I heard that individual say that he or she could rip down Mountain View Bible Church's building and, build it in 3 days. What would you think about that candidate if you heard they said something like that? I mean, or even to a greater extent, I can rip down a structure that took 46 years to build. In 3 days, I'll have it back standing the way it was. What would you think about somebody who said something like that? Yes?
Crazy. Crazy, and he was jealous.
Yeah, the first place my mind goes is like, that guy's crazy, right? Who would say something like that? And so I think some people, when they come to hearing about who Jesus is, they're like, that's crazy. Whatever you said about him, like, that guy's crazy. And that was the conclusion that they wanted to be drawn as a result of this. And the high priest, he stood up, it says, and said to him, Jesus, don't you have an answer to what these people are accusing you of? And Jesus just stood there and he kept silent. So they're claiming Jesus is crazy. But what we don't see represented in this story is what they really did to Jesus. They ignored the context of what Jesus said, and they changed Jesus' words. And on the other hand, if you found out later on after you said, this person would be crazy, we should never hire them as a pastor here at Mountain View. They're crazy talking. They're going to tear down the church building and rebuild it. Like, they don't know what they're talking about. Better stay away from that person. What if you heard a few weeks later that the person who said that about them completely made it up? How would you feel then? You've just let this person go who was a great candidate because of false testimony. And that's kind of what we're up against here. Because there was a context to that conversation that these two people were misrepresenting. It happened a long time ago, 3.5 years earlier at this point, toward the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. And John, in his gospel, he talks about it. He says, here's the context. The Jewish Passover was near, which it was near at the time of Jesus' arrest as well. So it was a few years, maybe 3 years before this, almost exactly 4 years. In the temple, Jesus found people selling oxen and sheep and doves, and he also found people exchanging money, sitting there. After making a whip out of cords, he drove everybody out of the temple with their sheep and their oxen and turned over the tables with the money changers' coins on them. And he told the people selling doves, get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace. And so after that, the Jews said, what sign are you going to show us? Why do you have authority, Jesus, to kick all these people out of the temple? And they were doing business unjustly. They were charging extremely high prices for animals to be sacrificed for Passover, and they were exchanging money into the temple currency at an obscene rate. They were charging a lot of extra money. So these people were in it for profit. They weren't in it for fairness, and Jesus just pushed the profiteering at other people's expenses out of the temple. The Jews said, what right do you have to do something like that? And Jesus' answer was, he said, destroy this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days. He says, I'll give you a sign of my authority. And the Jews said in that point in time, the temple took 46 years to build. You're going to raise it up in 3 days? But then John remarks and he says, but Jesus was really talking about the temple of his body. And that's a whole different context, isn't it? When you realize when Jesus said, if you destroy this temple, speaking about his body, I will raise it up again in 3 days. And you're like, oh, now I see what Jesus was talking about. But the people at the time, they just wanted to make Jesus look bad. They wanted to make him look like a crazy individual. That was the claim they were making. Jesus, on the other hand, he was claiming that he had the power to arise from the dead if the Jewish people destroyed his body. A promise he was about ready to make good on, not shortly after this in Matthew's story. As we continue on here, it says, then the high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you're the Messiah, the Son of God. So if you're not familiar with the Bible, the word Messiah comes up a lot. And the Jewish people all throughout the Old Testament of the Bible for 1,500 years had this idea that God would eventually send a king, and that king would rule over the earth and the world and everyone, all nations, forever and ever and ever. And there are other passages in the Old Testament that even describe that king as God himself living among people. And so for years and years and years, the Jewish people, they were looking forward to this person, but they were also highly skeptical because a lot of people came and went and claimed to be this future king, but they clearly were not. And so the high priest gets to the point where he said, we've been wondering about you for the last 3 years. We've been envious of you. Tell us, I'm going to put you under oath before the living God. Jesus, are you this figure or are you not? So they lack evidence of any criminal activity, but the high priest is saying, I want to force a confession. Because if he says yes, we know he obviously is not this person, so then we can put him to death. That's what the end goal is here when that question is asked. And Jesus, instead of staying silent like he does most of the other times, he actually gives an answer at this point. And he says, it's very interesting how he words it. He says, you said it yourself. That's what he tells the high priest. You came up with this concept and this idea in your mind that I might be the Messiah in the first place. You said it yourself. But he says more than that, more than the fact that you said it, he says, I tell you, from this very moment on, you will see the Son of Man or the Son of Human. And he uses that, that's how he speaks of himself in other places, but that's a term tied to the Old Testament in different places. He says, you will see this Son of Human seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And we hear that and we're like, what are you talking about, Jesus? You see, when Jesus says those lines, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power. We kind of get this idea that by the power of heaven, he's probably talking about God, right? But coming on the clouds of heaven, what is Jesus talking about? Well, the priests and the scribes and everybody that's intimately familiar with the Hebrew part of the Bible, the first 2/3 of the Bible we call the Old Testament, they know exactly what Jesus is talking about. For us, unless you were born Jewish or you had a crazy good education on the Old Testament, you're like, what is he talking about? He's actually quoting some very specific lines from the book of Daniel. So I want us to take a moment and look at that because it's not something we're supposed to know in our culture. We just wouldn't be familiar with that. But Jesus is making a very direct claim that he is this coming king. He's actually quoting from a place, Daniel chapter 7 in the Old Testament. And this is what Daniel described in that chapter. Daniel was seeing some kind of a vision that he claimed was from God. And as he was seeing this vision, kind of think of it as like a dream or this kind of altered state of consciousness while you're awake, kind of your mind goes to another place. And this is what he sees in his mind. He says, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days, God, took his seat on one of the thrones. His clothing was white like snow, and the hair of his head was white as wool. It doesn't mean God actually is that way, but in this dream or this vision that Daniel saw, that's the way he kind of realized this is God because, he had the white hair and the white clothes and just this light, this bright light was just emanating from him. It says his throne was like flaming fire. A river of fire was coming out from his presence, and then there were thousands upon thousands of people and angels worshiping him. So this is clearly like God that Daniel's seeing in some form in his vision. He says the court was gathered and the books were opened, and suddenly one like a son of man or a son of human, somebody that looked like a human, was coming on the clouds of heaven. We're like, oh, okay, I get it. That's what Jesus was talking about. That's where he was quoting. Somebody that looked like a person was arriving on the clouds of heaven. It says that figure approached the Ancient of Days, God, and was escorted before him, and he was given glory and a kingdom, so that people from every nation and language should serve him. His territory is an everlasting territory that won't ever pass away, and his kingdom is one that won't be destroyed. So Daniel was talking about this future coming forever king. And not just that, but this king would arrive on the clouds, would look like a human, and then would take a seat next to God. And in the Jewish mind, if you're sitting down right next to a king on a throne, you're putting yourself in equality with that king. And yet that's what Daniel saw hundreds of years before this in this vision. And Jesus is quoting from that and saying, you were looking forward to that figure, and I have arrived. You will see me coming on the clouds of heaven from this moment on. You will see me taking a seat next to the almighty eternal God. You will see me ruling forever. And at that point, all of the Jewish rulers, that was too much, because Jesus just concedes that in the Jewish mindset, he says, I am God, I am like God, and I'm about to be enthroned beside God forever and ever. And at that moment, the high priest, he just tears his robes, which is a just an exclamation of utter disbelief and grief and anger. And he's like, blasphemy! We don't need any more witnesses. He deserves death. And the courts very quickly concluded he deserves death. He deserves death. I want to show you this just to kind of embed this in your mind a little bit. So I'm going to have you forward a little bit on the, let's hold off right here for a second. Okay. When it comes to Jesus riding on the clouds of heaven, there's a psalm, and it tells us why that imagery might have been included in Daniel's vision. And I want to give that to you as well because I think it helps us to understand more about who God is and more about who Jesus is claiming to be in this situation. Daniel's vision of God or the Son of Human arriving on a cloud, it's really drawn off of the imagery in a psalm or a song or a poem. It's Psalm 68. It's something that was written, again, many years before this point in time. And this is what Psalm 68 says toward the end. It says, sing to God, you kingdoms of the earth. Sing praises to the Lord. So the psalm is about praising God. Praise him who rides on the ancient highest skies. Now, if somebody's riding on something in the skies, what are they normally going to be riding on? Don't have a lot of options, right? There's blue, there's clouds, there's the sun. And so this poem is setting up God as somebody who's like super high up, who comes in riding on the clouds, riding on the ancient clouds and the ancient skies. It says, look, he thunders with his powerful voice. So like the clouds, God thunders. Ascribe power to God. You see a storm roll in and you think about the power of the clouds. And the writer of this psalm is saying God is like that. God's like a cloud. His majesty is over Israel, just like clouds just cover the skies, and they're over us right now, even outside. His power is among the clouds. We think about power and energy and electricity being among the clouds and thunderstorms. And then the psalm ends, God, you are awe-inspiring in your sanctuaries. It is awesome to look out at the sky and the clouds, especially in this area where we get tons of sunshine. It's inspiring. We think about how sometimes we maybe laid back on the ground as kids and we would look up the clouds and dream about what they looked like, right? We'd see shapes in the clouds. And so in the same way that clouds are powerful and they're inspiring and they're high, God is similar in those ways. So I put just a couple of pictures here. We'll just go through those, maybe spend about 5 seconds on each one, just to give us a visual of how God is over all. But God is powerful. God is very powerful. And God, again, his power is among the clouds. But it's this great, expansive power. And so the writer of Psalm 68 and Daniel would say, God is like the clouds. God is arriving on the clouds. And Jesus is saying that same power that was attributed to God, the same ways that God is like clouds, that's me. And so if you were to ask Jesus what he was claiming about himself, that's how he would answer you. But the conversation goes on, and many more people make other claims, very different claims than what Jesus might make or have made about himself. It says, then the high priest tore his robes and said he is blasphemed. Again, the courts decide this guy's worthy of death, and you can advance on to the next slide in that as well. So the high priest charges Jesus with blasphemy. Oh, I forgot about that. We'll go ahead and, I was going to give you another visual, okay? Might as well since it's on the screen, because now you're curious. But there's a meme that's been going around lately the past couple of years, and it's tell me that you're something without telling me, okay? So tell me you're old without telling me you're old. Or tell me you're an American without telling me you're an American. And that's what Jesus was doing. It would be, tell me you're the Messiah, this coming king who is God himself, without telling me. And Jesus would say, that's who I am. But again, the other people in the room, they vastly disagree. And Jesus gets charged with blasphemy. We hear the word blasphemy a lot. What does it really mean? It's insulting somebody's reputation. You can advance on through the slides as well. It's advancing somebody's, or insulting somebody's reputation. And in this case, the high priest charges Jesus with insulting God's reputation. because he's claiming to, in essence, be God, do what he said. And so the court is making this claim, Jesus is obviously not that. He is not the cloud rider. He is not like God. He is not the forever king. He's an imposter. It says when daybreak came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people, they plotted against Jesus to put him to death. One problem, they can't put someone to death because they're living in a territory, in a province that's controlled by the Roman government at the time. So they don't have the legal authority to put someone to death. So they tie him up. It says they led him away and they handed him over to Pilate, the Roman governor. Now the governor had a custom at the Passover festival, which it was at this point in time, to hand over to the crowd any prisoner they wanted, one prisoner. And so when they gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Who do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" He says, for he knew it was because of envy that they had handed him over. So Pilate, he's not dumb. He knows that these leaders in Israel have been envious of Jesus and all the new attention and his authority and the things he's been saying and the fact that they can't ask him any question he can't answer, the fact that he seems to always have, some direction to point people, and they're super envious of that. And Pilate realizes what's happening here. And so he says, I'm going to give him a real tough choice. I'm going to take Barabbas, who's a violent insurrectionist, and I'm going to offer to set him free. Or they can just have Jesus, who they envy, but who's a pretty harmless person. What are they going to pick? And so it says the chief priests and the elders, they persuaded the crowds because in the morning on a certain day at the Passover feast, they would gather together outside of Pilate's palace and await for him to come out on the steps and give them this offer of who to release. So there's people that are there already, and they persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas to be released. And so Pilate said, what do you want me to do with Jesus then? And they started shouting, crucify him, crucify him. So the crowd chose Barabbas, this violent criminal, to be released and insisted that Jesus be condemned to death. So what were they claiming about Jesus? It's pretty clear. So Pilate says, why? What has he done wrong? But it says they kept shouting all the more, crucify him, crucify him. And when Pilate saw he was getting nowhere, but that a riot was starting, he took some water and he washed his hands in front of everybody and he said, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. Now Pilate, he was not a pushover. He was actually a very cruel Roman governor who took a lot of power in his own hands. He did several things and had Jews murdered because of really the things that they did in order to set an example for the other Jewish people not to revolt. So why was he so easily persuaded by the crowds here? There's a moment in history that I think gives us a little bit of light into this. Pilate was appointed to his governorship a couple of years before this by a Roman man named Sejanus. And Sejanus was not the Roman emperor. Trajan was the Roman emperor. But Trajan, he was in his mid-60s. And in our mid-60s, sometimes we start thinking about retirement a little bit, right? And so was he, even though he was over Rome. So he decided to retire to the island of Capri. And he spent most of his time there. But he appointed the captain of the Praetorian, his own personal bodyguard in Rome, who was Sejanus, over things in Rome, just to see to the empire, to administrate the day-to-day affairs for about 5 years. And while Trajan was away, Sejanus started to slowly but surely remove people from power. His opponents, his political opponents, people who were next in line for the emperorship of Rome, next in line to become Caesar. He started eliminating these people, and he was very good at covering his tracks. He also appointed some officials, some of them were kind of ruthless, to different positions around the empire. And eventually, Trajan caught word of this. Somebody betrayed his actions. And so Trajan sent a letter to the Senate of Rome. And on the same day that the letter arrived, Sejanus was arrested and executed for his treasonous acts against the emperor. And then Trajan didn't stop there. He started to root out all the people throughout the Roman Empire that had been appointed to positions by Sejanus and have them executed. Or people that had allied themselves with Sejanus. He had them executed and pulled out of prison. So he was cleaning house. And Pilate realized, I'm a little bit too close to Sejanus. I don't want to do anything that's going to draw any attention to me from the emperor, right? And so having the Jews make a scene here would be really bad for my life. And so I'm going to try to appease them, even though he thought Jesus was innocent. So Pilate concludes Jesus is innocent, but it's this pressure due to fear of Caesar, I believe, from history that causes him to cave in. Again, that's my personal thoughts. Maybe that's not correct, but that's what I see playing out through history. But Jesus is not a threat. He's just this guy. He's not really done anything wrong. He's innocent. But on the same hand, he's not God. He's just this guy that the Jews have an envious problem with. Just a guy. That's his conclusion about Jesus. And then the people say something that I think is quite unnecessary here and kind of bold. I don't know why they say this, but the Jewish crowds, they answer Pilate this way when he turns Jesus over to them. They say, his blood be on us and our children. So we accept responsibility for this. You've concluded Jesus is innocent. He may be innocent, but we accept full responsibility for what's about to happen to Jesus. Those consequences, they can fall on us and on our kids and our kids' kids and our kids' kids' kids and our descendants. We take full responsibility for the execution of Jesus. It's a dangerous claim to make, especially if Jesus and what his claim about himself is really reality. But again, they've concluded Jesus is just a fake. He's another imposter. But that's their conclusion. It says, then he released Barabbas to them because that's what they asked for. And after having Jesus flogged, he handed him over to be crucified. At this point, the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the governor's residence, which is a palace on the west side of Jerusalem, and gathered the whole company around him. The word company is cohort. It was 480 Roman soldiers that surrounded Jesus at this point. And typically, in a situation where you were going to crown someone and make them king, you'd be surrounded by a group of people, maybe even a group of soldiers or a group of political supporters or a group of friends, and you would usher somebody into becoming king. And when Matthew says these last words that we're going to look at this morning about Jesus, I think what he's telling us is this is actually the moment when Jesus is being crowned king. Because Matthew does believe that Jesus is king forever, that Jesus is like God, that Jesus is God, that Jesus has authority over all people and nations forever, and that he will receive a kingdom that never ends. Matthew does believe this about Jesus. And I think that Matthew is actually presenting these moments as Jesus' actual coronation as king. That's an opinion. But I think because of the way the narrative flows, that's the claim that he's making. But this is a coronation unlike any other coronation that you would normally see. When King Charles was crowned in Britain maybe a year and a half ago or so, it was pomp and circumstance and people and ceremony and the whole nation gathered around. It was an era of solemnity and celebration. Everybody was serious and they were rejoicing. But this is anything but that. 480 Roman soldiers, they make Jesus king, but it's going to be in a very mocking way. It says they stripped him and they dressed him in a scarlet robe. And there's that image that I want to focus on this morning. And as I explain this, I want to tie this in with our communion. We call it communion of the Lord's Supper, or some denominations call it Eucharist or sacrament. But it's where we take a small cup of juice, grape juice, and a small piece of bread. We remember Jesus' sacrifice. The bread represents Jesus' broken body. The juice represents Jesus' blood. But even more than that, it represents this covenant, this partnership that we have with God as followers of Jesus. And we talked about that in more detail the last time we did this communion service. So I won't focus on that, but I want to focus on the scarlet. And so as you look at this color in the cup, think about the scarlet and this imagery and what Jesus experienced today. But I'd like to have 4 people who'd be willing to come up and serve these elements to us as I kind of explain a little bit about scarlet this morning. Anybody want to come up and help us out today? All right. I'll have you guys maybe take this side here. Thanks. And then just pick one of the sides and skip a row. Thank you so much. This is what a robe of scarlet might have looked like. This isn't a Roman robe of scarlet. It might have been something that the soldiers had, or one of the more of like high-ranking officials or soldiers happened to have on them. at Pilate's palace here. It is his governor's residence. But this will give you an idea of the color. Because scarlet in the Old Testament of the Bible, scarlet in the New Testament of the Bible, was made with a very specific process. But this deep, rich red is the color that you would have experienced and that Jesus would have had on him. But I think it's the process of getting this colored dye that I find interesting with relationship to Jesus. And so I want to have us go to the next slide. This is gross, isn't it? There's all these bugs all over this branch. So these are bugs. I think this is not the Latin name for them, but they're called Kermes insects. And they gather on branches and things like that. But they're small red insects. And there's a process that happens. This is a collection of them. But what I want to show you in the next picture is just one. Now, this is one of the insects. The female insects, near the end of their life cycle, they attach themselves very firmly to a branch. And they almost look like a small little tiny snail or something, or like a little bubble, like a brown bubble. And then they lay their eggs underneath them. And then they die to become this protective case around their young. What would happen at this point in time is that as they were on the tree encasing their young, people would come by and collect those little nodules, and then the larvae, the really infantile larvae inside. And they would dry them, and then they would crush them, and it would become this intense red powder that they would add to water, and they would use to dye the fabric to achieve that really, really bright red effect. And so Jesus' body, it's already bleeding from the whipping and the beating, but they dress him in this red scarlet robe. The reason why I think it's so interesting is Psalm 22. It's a psalm in the Old Testament, but it's speaking about this future king and this future Messiah. And ironically, this ruler, this forever king, makes a statement in that psalm. And he says, I am a worm and not a human. We think, well, that's odd. But the word is not actually worm. In Hebrew, the word is, I am a scarlet and not a human. And so this psalm that's, again, portraying this future promised king to Israel is equating this future promised king with one of these insects being crushed or pulverized for the red that forms the dye. But at the same time, the reason why this female insect is, encased like this is to provide life for her young. And so, in some ways, we're supposed to equate, I think, in this moment, Jesus, certainly through Psalm 22, but maybe also through this robe that's placed around him of scarlet, with Jesus being the scarlet one. He's the one that, first of all, gives his own life for our protection. But second of all, he's crushed. And in that process, there, definitely is this red, this coloring, and everything is, there's a similarity. But I think we're supposed to kind of connect those dots. A lot of these words, especially in the way that the Hebrew people wrote their literature, these words like scarlet, it's supposed to make you think, where have I heard of that word before? Oh, I've heard of that word before in Psalm 22. What was that speaking about? That was speaking about the future promised king being crushed like this insect to produce the dye. And now this future king is being clothed with something that was made from that. Isn't that interesting? And so Jesus is about to give his life on our behalf. I think that's the takeaway. So as we celebrate communion this morning, let's remember Jesus' body that was broken, and we're in the midst of this process now of seeing that, but also his blood that was shed for us. And you could even say for our protection. But the other form of significance is when you crown a king, oftentimes you place a robe on that individual. And so this is part of Jesus' coronation. Next, it says they twisted together a crown of thorns, and they put it on his head, and they placed a staff, a ruling staff, in his right hand. And they knelt down before him and mocked him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" So they crown him. And this is Jesus' very ironic coronation. It says, then they spat on him, they took the staff, and they kept hitting him on the head with it. And after they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe, put his own clothing on, and led him away to crucify him. So they come up with other cruel forms of treatment, and that's what they subject Jesus to abuse him and to insult him. That's how they celebrate Jesus' kingship. And it's a huge irony. And it kind of makes me question, how do I celebrate Jesus' kingship. Some people do. They hear this and they think it's just ludicrous. This is crazy talk. And they might mock it. Other people might say, oh, I've got to look into this a little bit more. Or, Jesus was a great teacher. He's got some good moral points, but that's probably where things end. And then for other people, they have this idea that Jesus is much, much more. So he has told the Jewish courts, I'm stepping into my kingship from now on. And then he allows himself to be crowned in such a humiliating way. I normally ask a lot of questions as we go through our discussion. This morning has been fairly light on the questions, but I do want to open this up for your thoughts as we conclude right now. Why would Jesus allow himself to be crowned, to go through a coronation like that? Why would he choose that for the first moment of his kingship? What do you think? I mean, it could have played out some other way. Yeah. It does show incredible humility. Yeah, I don't think you can argue with that. Somebody that would deserve such an immaculate celebration, allowing themselves to be crowned in such humbling, humiliating circumstances. Like, I don't think of God oftentimes like in the same way as like humble and humility. But this is showing us the true nature of who Jesus really is. And if you believe Jesus is God, it's showing you a window into how God really is and the extreme humility that God has as a person. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
He doesn't demand what he deserves.
Okay, yeah, he doesn't demand what he deserves. And that's a huge lesson for all of us, right? Because it's so easy for us to demand the things that we deserve, right? We have our rights. And Jesus really lays down his rights here. And maybe that's a deeper conversation about when you lay down your rights and when you don't, but Jesus does not demand what he deserves. So it shows us that. Yeah. Nick?
I was just going to say it shows God's commitment to save no matter what we've done.
Okay, yeah. It shows God's commitment to save no matter what we've done. And to be fair, this salvation that through Jesus' followers was being opened up to the world, it wasn't exclusive. It was open to these same people that insulted Jesus. Those 480 soldiers, they were just as welcome into the kingdom of God as anybody else. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yes?
It shows the importance of obedience.
Shows the importance of obedience. Okay, in what way? As far as Jesus' obedience, is that what you're focusing on? Okay,
Yeah.
sure.
Because even, he knew what was
Mm-hmm.
coming.
Yeah.
He asked God to pass it.
Yeah.
He was still obedient throughout.
That's a good point. Yeah, Jesus, he had this point where he was praying and he said, Father, I want your will, not my will, right? I'm willing to go through it, even knowing what was ahead. And moments like this were what was ahead. Sure. A couple other thoughts. It shows us how oftentimes people do miscelebrate Jesus' kingship. It shows a huge contrast, too, between, I think, the way of Jesus' kingdom, and that would be the humility and other things as well, and the way that people default, Jesus' way is very, very different. It's willing to deal with things that normal humanity and the way we think and operate is not. Demonstrates the depth of God's love for people. It portrays Jesus as a suffering servant. And that was the way that the prophet Isaiah spoke of this coming king and this Messiah figure. So it's another way to identify perhaps Jesus as the one who was predicted to be. Maybe it shows the severity of what we deserve from walking away from our covenant, our partnership with God as humans. Maybe it's an example of how to endure unjust treatment and unjust suffering. Maybe it's all these things that you've mentioned. There's a lot of things that we can learn from this. In the way that what Jesus allows to happen to him. But as we close, I just want to take a step back and look at the big picture. Here's the big picture of all this. One, everybody judges Jesus. We all do. So what do you think about him? Maybe you're somewhere on the spectrum of what different people concluded about Jesus. And again, I don't think that what we talked about today should convince you to make a certain decision about what you think of Jesus. I think it's a process of trying to figure that out for yourself. But what ultimately, what do you claim about Jesus? Because we all got to land somewhere. Secondly, to a degree, even though if they're unaware, maybe most times, everybody is going to celebrate or react to Jesus' kingship. And this is kind of related to the other question because it depends on who you think Jesus is. But how are you celebrating Jesus' kingship? Especially if you believe he is king, you know? For most of us, we're like, well, I go to church on Sundays. That's how I celebrate. But maybe it could get a little bit broader than that. There's other ways to celebrate who Jesus is in our lives. So just some things to think about as we step toward, again, the events of the Easter weekend coming up at the end of the month.